Hello, and welcome to Socialism, the weekly Marxist analysis podcast from the Socialist Party. This episode, we're continuing our analysis of the 2019 Euro elections, but looking beyond Britain, to the continent as a whole. Ruling establishment parties have had their noses bloodied, the Greens and populist right made gains, and the overall picture is turmoil for the European capitalists. So what is the cause of all this political turbulence? Why didn't the left make gains out of it? And how can workers in Europe capitalise on the crisis for the bosses? We'll be hearing a view from the Committee for Workers International, the world socialist organisation which the Socialist Party in England and Wales is part of.
Thanks very much for that, Scott. So this episode we'll be talking to Bob Labi from the Committee for Workers International. Thanks for joining us, Bob.
Great pleasure.
And we're going to be discussing the political situation across the continent of Europe in the wake of the recent EU elections. In the last episode, we discussed the ramifications in Britain, and now we're looking more generally at Europe as a whole. So the first question, which I think our listeners might like to know about, is, of course, the recent EU election results were a real mixed bag across the entire continent. So what does the Committee for Workers International consider were the main features?
If you look in general at the countries, the main features was a continuing rejection of many of the traditional parties and also a deep scepticism towards the different structures of the different states. Both, if you like, the structures of the individual states, like you saw that in rejection of ruling parties in individual states, and also the continuing suspicion of the EU itself.
And the CWI has analysed these results as linked to the 2007 to 2008 financial crash and the economic crisis which has played out since then. Why is that?
Well, really, the last 12 years or so have been a tremendous turning point. Not just the impact of the crisis which developed 12 years ago, but also the continuing effects of this crisis, economically, politically and socially. That in most countries of the world, especially in Europe and also in North America, there's been a decline of living standards, that in many countries, including like in Britain and some other countries in Europe, the living standards today are still below what they were before the last crisis hit. And at the same time as you've had this big decline in living standards and a generally worsening of social conditions, there's also been this tremendous polarisation of wealth towards the very tops of the ruling class. And all of that has fueled this growing dissatisfaction, and as I said before, a rejection in many countries of traditional parties and also the traditional structures as well.
And there's been political developments, haven't there? There's been new left formations, for example. We've seen Corbynism in this country. You mentioned North America. There's been the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. We've seen Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain. What kind of results did they receive?
Well, I think before we look at what actually happened in the elections, what we need to remember is that in many countries, the initial response to the impact of the crisis was an idea of resistance, of fighting to try and prevent living standards falling. And we saw that in country after country. Not in every country. For instance, in Germany, the trade union leaders agreed with the employers the idea of tightening the belts, saying to German workers, tighten the belts, accept a drop in living standards, but that will be temporary, but at least you'll keep your jobs and then things will get better. So that was a sort of exception. But in many other countries, including in Britain and elsewhere, we saw resistance against the effect of the crisis. Sometimes the resistance was based in trade unions or in social struggles, but also in political developments as well. That you saw a searching for new parties, like some of the parties which you just mentioned, where you saw developments of completely new formations, like Podemos in Spain, or where, like in Greece with Syriza, existing small left formations, suddenly developed mass support. And this was the initial reaction to the crisis. But then, as soon as these developments took place, they were put to the test. What happened in many countries, unfortunately, is that the protest movements which developed were often handicapped by the role of the existing trade union leaders, where they attempted to prevent all-out confrontations developing.
And we saw that in this country, didn't we, with the November 30th pension strikes in 2011?
Well, exactly. You had a momentum in this country, but it was similar in other countries as well in Europe. You had protest movements, which the trade union leaders, because they weren't prepared really to challenge the ruling classes, because many of the trade union leaders accepted the idea of working within capitalism and therefore weren't really prepared to challenge the system. They tried to limit these movements. We saw that in the Republic of Ireland, where you had a big protest movement against the effects of the cuts, but then the trade union leaders, in what was called the Croke Park Agreement, made a deal with the government to end the protests. This gave rise to a sort of questioning of the role of the trade union leaders, but also in other countries where you had political developments. Most of these political forces, which either were entirely new or, as I said before, suddenly developed mass support, were put to a test, and unfortunately, most of them failed the test in the sense of not fighting for a real change, or not even fighting to defend living standards.
And perhaps most markedly, of course, there was the case of Syriza, wasn't there, whose abject failure, unfortunately, after organising a mass referendum against austerity to really stand up to the European Union, has had terrible repercussions. And that's part of, as you say, most of these new left formations coming out of the economic crisis, unfortunately not having delivered. But why, for example, has that resulted in a swing to PSOE, which is in effect an establishment party, formerly social democratic, in the Spanish state?
I think you have to look at the different, at each individual country. In Greece, the example which you gave of Syriza has given rise to the victory of the right-wing party, New Democracy, and the calling of early elections for July this year, which it's likely that New Democracy will actually win quite decisively. But at the same time, there is a polarisation in society, in many societies, and therefore in that situation, like in Spain, where you had an attempt by the right-wing parties to seize the initiative, in that situation, the polarisation continued. But what happened was that Podemos, the new left party which had developed, was not seen as an alternative. And in that situation, the voters, if you like, rallied around PSOE, the Spanish Social Democratic Party, which previously had carried out cuts, but was seen as a lesser evil to the right-wing parties. And in that polarised situation, PSOE were able to become the largest party in the Spanish election. But that flowed from the situation in Spain itself. It wasn't repeated in all the other countries of Europe.
So that particular situation, would you say, was it that Podemos had been really supporting the kind of policies put forward by PSOE and not putting forward a clear alternative line?
That was part of the reason, and therefore in that situation, people didn't see the point in voting for Podemos, given that the Podemos leadership was saying they would support a PSOE government. And in that situation, where Podemos itself did not have a clear programme, there was a natural feeling to rally around PSOE as as a way of trying to block the right-wing victory. But even having said that, there was still a polarisation in Spain, with the development of the new right-wing party, the Vox, which scored a success in the general election in Spain, which was then followed in the European election a few weeks later in that country. So you've got there in Spain, despite the victory of PSOE, a polarisation, and for the first time in many years in Spain, the development of a far-right party with sizable support.
And in fact, the far right and the populist right have made some gains throughout these European elections. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a combination of different factors. On the one hand, there is the issue that in a number of countries, the traditional left, or even the so-called new left forces which developed, didn't provide an answer, didn't provide a way out of the crisis. And in that situation, it prepared the way for the far right, using populist slogans to try and build support. In some cases, quite significantly. And we've seen this even before the crisis, in a number of countries, where the far right, using a combination of populism, a bit like Trump uses in the US, where he pretends to be for the ordinary working man against the elite and things like that. But that's not a new phenomenon. We've seen that in other countries as well. And on this basis, it's allowed the right, the far right, the populist right, to get a certain echo. At the same time, they've exploited in different countries nationalism, maybe in different forms nationalism, even in the form of nationalism against the EU, in the sense of defending, quote, small countries against the big countries inside the EU, but also exploiting in a number of countries the big wave of migration which Europe saw a few years ago, where the social questions which the migration, the big increase in migration posed, was not answered by the left. Where in a situation of social crisis, a rapid increase in population naturally posed the question of where are the social resources going to be to provide homes, jobs, healthcare, education for the migrants. And the fact that many of the left forces really adopted a purely moral point of view, that refugees are welcome here, without answering the social questions, allowed the elements of the far right to exploit the migration, partly on the basis of nationalism. There was an element, obviously, of racism as well, but also arguing in a demagogic way that the country couldn't afford the big increase in population. Therefore, it had to be controlled. And the only way of answering that would have been challenging the capitalist system itself and saying that there are the potential resources to provide these the necessary resources, etc., the necessary improvement in the conditions. But the only way you can do that is by struggling against capitalism itself.
So, of course, the far right, playing on these understandable fears, particularly in working class communities, of diminishing resources in a time of austerity, of privatisation and so on, at the same time is defending the very economic and social system which is forcing those privations on working class people. Now, the other big winners in the EU elections would be perceived to be the Greens. What do you think that means?
I think that the Green successes reflect a number of different issues. On the one hand, obviously, we've seen a very important movement in a number of countries recently on the question of climate change, demanding action to prevent the degeneration of the climate, to act against the environmental threats which are posed at the present time. And obviously, the size of these protests, even though quite a number of those people protesting were young people who in many countries didn't have the right to vote, nevertheless, it had an important impact in the whole of in the society as well. But also you had a situation in a number of countries where the Greens were seen as a sort of semi-established party, which nevertheless could be viewed as an alternative. That certainly was the case, for instance, in Germany, where the Greens had a big success, even though in some ways they are an establishment party. The Greens are in different parts of Germany in coalition with all different sorts of parties. They have no problem with being in coalition with the right-wing Christian Democrats or with the Social Democratic Party. Perhaps it's a bit forgotten now, but at the beginning of this century, when the Greens were in national government in Germany with the Social Democrats, they introduced quite brutal attacks on the unemployed in Germany, the so-called Hartz IV attacks, which are still remembered to this day. But nevertheless, the Greens in many countries were able, if you like, to give themselves a new coat of paint and present themselves as being to a certain extent outside the establishment, and therefore able to actually gain significant support in a number of countries. But like all these parties, which have significant increases in support, they are put to the test. And the question is, what happens when they actually come into government? What actually do they do? And that's what means that for many of these parties, going into government can actually open up a period of crisis for them.
So the Greens were seen in Germany by maybe some younger people, by maybe sections of workers, as some kind of alternative to the government which they faced, which was continuing the terrible conditions in which they lived. But of course, there's also one of these new left formations, Die Linke, the Left Party, which is present in Germany. Why didn't that make gains in the same way that the Greens did?
I think there are two reasons, unfortunately, why the Linke actually didn't suffered a loss in support in the elections, quite a significant loss in support in these elections, and the reasons are twofold. On the one hand, there is the continuing situation where, in a number of parts of Germany, the Linke is part of governing coalitions, either at city level or at regional state level, and in those cases, they're not seen as fundamentally different from the other parties. Secondly, the left party in Germany does not have a clear programme. Now, on paper, for instance, it criticises the EU for being in the hands of big business and makes a series of criticisms. But that's on paper in its programme. It's not part of its campaign. It's not a real campaign to say that we're against this EU, which is in favour of capitalism, in favour of big business, and that is not the way to, if you like, a genuine united Europe of the peoples of Europe. That can only take place on the basis of struggle against capitalism itself, and, if you like, showing a way in which working people in Europe can act together to change society. That is not the programme they adopted. And so in that situation, if you like, they were not able to hold their support, they lost support, and they were not seen as providing real answers to the issues which face the population in Germany, which is one of the reasons why you had in Germany the increase in support for the far-right AfD, and also, as we mentioned before, for the Greens. And what it shows is that you can have a party which even has a reasonable programme on paper, but the question is, do they campaign on the programme? Do they really campaign on it? Do they emphasise what they're fighting for? So it's clear where they stand, and it's also clear how they want to go ahead and implement their programme. I'm sure that's one of the things you discussed in the previous podcast in regard to Britain. Whereas if you look on paper, many in Britain, Corbyn has got a number of policies which are quite striking, which stand quite clearly, but they're not campaigned upon in a systematic way. They're not campaigned upon every day as a way of mobilising support, but then also showing how they're going to be actually implemented. And in that situation, if you like, left formations can grow, but then they can lose support. One of the noticeable things in these European elections was a collapse in support for the Dutch Socialist Party. It suffered a very big setback in its vote. At one stage it was around 10% in the electorate. It dropped very sharply. There's a crisis opened up in the party, and that shows that, if you like, one electoral success is not a guarantee of what will happen in the future. We saw that in Scotland a few years ago with the Scottish Socialist Party, which had a big electoral success, but then, because of its policies, it lost everything and it more or less disintegrated. In these elections, we saw in Belgium a very significant increase for the Belgian Workers' Party, the PTB. It scored a big success in the elections in Belgium, because there it wasn't just the European elections, it was also national elections taking place at the same time. They had a big success there, but the fact that they had a success in one election is not a guarantee for what will happen. And that's why this question of what parties stand for, what their programme is and what they do is so important, because otherwise electoral successes or even electoral defeats can be fleeting moments, and they don't decide where actually society is going.
So programme is essential then, a programme to appeal to and unite all the various sections of the working class, to satisfy all the demands of the mass of the population, but also to be able to take on big business, the profit interests, the capitalists who seek to undermine those because they affect their bottom line. And of course, we would argue as Marxists that if you're going to do that, you need to find an alternative power in society to base yourselves on. And for us, of course, that is the working class, which can shut society down, for example, through strike action, The organised working class represented in the trade unions, for example, has enormous potential power in society, and unfortunately those aspects of programme and that pointing towards an alternative power in society which could change the system, in fact move towards a socialist society, is absent from a lot of these new left formations and from the Greens. So a lot of people will be asking, what will be the effects of this huge polarisation in politics in European countries, both for the capitalist establishment, but particularly for working class and young people aspiring to improve their conditions?
I think there are two ways of looking at this. First of all, there's the general background, the whole situation, which is one of instability on a world scale, growing tensions between different powers, reflected both between the EU and, for instance, Trump, but also within the EU itself. Mm-hmm. So we have the situation where Trump is still arguing against the EU on the question of trade, threatening, for instance, to introduce extra tariffs on auto exports from the EU to the US. At the same time, within the EU, there is a struggle over which powers are going to really decide how the EU functions. It's partly linked to a question of who gets which position in the EU itself. There are tensions between the different EU countries on different issues, which of course can be strengthened by the impact of Brexit, not just in Britain and Ireland, but in the EU as a whole. And even the impact of Brexit raises the other questions inside the EU itself, where, for instance, in Italy, there is a discussion which has been going on and off for some time. Should Italy really use the euro currency, or should it pull out? The Italian government is now floating the idea of establishing some kind of parallel currency inside Italy alongside the euro. Technically that's illegal, but what would happen if they actually carried it out?
Good question.
It would be illegal in terms of the European treaties. So you've got all these sort of tensions, which of course can be added by a downturn in the world economy, which many of the strategists of capital are worried about. And against that European and worldwide background, you then have the situation in different countries, where there's great instability. In France, there was sort of talk that wasn't it good that Macron party got the same result, more or less, as it got in the first rounds of the presidential election. It got 22% of the vote. Well, they're presenting 22% as a victory, but it means that, 78% were against him, those who voted. It indicates he's not exactly popular. All he gets is 1 in 5 of the voters. And if you count the people who didn't vote, that's even more are opposed to him. So it's an indication of the instability. As a result of the vote in Germany, the leader of the Social Democratic Party has just resigned. There's questioning how long will the German coalition continue? Will it last to 2021? So you've got instability in different forms in different countries. But what it reflects is not just a rejection of what is happening, but a searching, a testing out. What is the way forward? What can be done? And that's why different parties, they enjoy, bursts of support electorally or maybe in the opinion polls. But then the question is, can they actually deliver? That's when they're put to the test. It doesn't mean they necessarily immediately collapse. You see that with some of the right-wing parties, the right-wing populist or demagogic parties, where they can keep their support for a time on the basis of just continually attacking the other parties, mixed in with an element of nationalism and sometimes racism as well. So it doesn't automatically mean that there's rapid developments from one year to the next. It can be, but it depends on the situation. But the most important thing is when there'll be a popular idea that something needs to be done. The protest voting in elections is not enough. When actual struggles develop on different issues, you can't foretell immediately what the issues will be, but it's a very explosive situation in Europe. And when struggles actually begin, when people decide, working people especially, decide they have to move into action, that's when you'll see really fundamental changes beginning to take place.
And we've seen a little foretaste of that, haven't we, with the Gilets jaunes movement in France, which we've analysed, including with eyewitness accounts, people who were participants in some of the demonstrations in earlier episodes of this podcast. So the Committee for a Workers' International has identified the possibility for big movements in any European country on all sorts of different questions, depending on the particular different situations in those countries, but also, as you've just said, the rising tensions between the different capitalist powers of Europe. So I think a lot of people will be asking, does this mean the breakup of the European Union? Does this mean that the far right, the nationalist right, the populist right, is going to make big gains out of that? And what is necessary to have a successful resolution to this polarised crisis situation for workers and young people in Europe?
The future of both the EU itself and the euro currency are open. I mean, recently there have been articles celebrating the fact that the euro currency has lasted 20-odd years. And there was almost a sense of surprise that it's lasted for so long because of the inherent contradictions, the conflicts between the different nation states in Europe. And it cannot be ruled out that in a time of crisis there could be some kind of reconfiguration of the euro currency itself, a breakup of the eurozone as it currently exists, and at the same time, crises could lead to reconfigurations or massive changes, or even a collapse of the European Union itself, or certainly the collapse in its present form, and that is something which is inherent both in the crisis and also the fact that inside Europe, it's still based upon national capitalist states where the national capitalist classes have got their own interests. Sometimes they can collaborate together, trying to profit together from a situation, but other times they come into conflict. And this is one reason why, despite the pretense of the apologists for the European Union, it's not going to lead to united Europe, and doesn't mean that all forms of tensions and conflicts in Europe have actually been done away with forever. And in that situation where you've got these potential crises developing, the question is, who will show a way out?
Right.
As you said yourself just a moment ago, in this sort of crisis situation, as was mentioned, you could have the different nationalist and far-right forces attempting to profit from such a crisis, attempting to profit from a conflict between the different EU countries. And in that situation, the question would be, what alternative would the workers' movement pose? Unfortunately, in many countries, the leaders of the workers' movement have become, if you like, apologists for the European Union itself, arguing that the European Union safeguards the interests of working people, which fundamentally it doesn't. And the question of offering an alternative is one which is key, of saying, yes, what is the way to, if you like, prevent conflict in Europe? What is the way to secure and develop living standards in Europe? What is the way to begin to break from the capitalist system, which by its very nature is unstable, which by its very nature cannot guarantee permanent increases in living standards, etc. And in fact, in times of crisis, threatens a regression, threatens a falling back. And in this question of arguing for an alternative, there needs to be a complete change inside the workers' movement in Britain and internationally in Europe. Because what is needed is the adoption of a programme which deals with these issues, which deals with these crises, and accepts that there can be no solution on the basis of capitalism. And that means offering an alternative. Now, how can that be visualised? How can that be campaigned for? And really what it is to challenge the basis of capitalism itself. The question of the basis of capitalism, which is production for profit, not from the point of view of the common good. And the point about the workers' movement is, by its very nature, the workers' movement is based upon collective struggle, the idea of working people coming together, struggling collectively for a common goal. And from that comes the idea of what would happen if the economic and social resources, not just of countries, but of regions, but of the world itself, were actually planned in the interests of working people and not simply for who makes a profit. And we see today with globalization that that the idea of international planning is something which is feasible. We see it in how the multinationals operate, in how, if you like, distribution is organized around the world. They plan on a worldwide scale. They show the technique is there to do it. The question is in whose interests. And that idea of an alternative, of a collectively based democratic alternative, which decides how the resources of the countries, of the regions and of the world are used in the interests of the vast majority of the population rather than just to the profit for the few, is absolutely key. And it's this sort of vision which is needed, which can then say that yes, it is possible to have another Europe, but another Europe which isn't capitalist, which isn't run in the interests of the different European ruling classes, but it's run in the interests of working people. That is the alternative which is posed, and if it is not posed, then there is the danger that in a time of crisis there will be a fallback towards nationalism, the fallback between rivalries between the different countries, not simply between the different ruling classes, but also how the ruling classes would use that crisis to try and mobilize their own populations in hostilities against neighbours.
So the only fundamental solution to a society or a world situation which is starting to ratchet up the tensions between competing national capitalist classes on the basis of profit is to eliminate that, to have a system which is based, instead of on private profit, on public ownership, on democratic planning of resources, as you have said, which, as we would say, is a socialist society on a national and an international scale. And that, of course, is what the Committee for a Workers' International, the Socialist Party's England and Wales section of the Committee for a Workers' International, exists to campaign for on a global scale.
Exactly. But to make that real, to explain what it actually means, to show what is the potential which exists already, how capitalism has in a way developed the potential but then misuses it, and how that potential can be used in the interest of working people, to have sustainable production, to be able to develop living standards without ruining the environment, to be able to get rid of the fear of booms and slumps, of regular crises, and in that way to give a vision of what life could actually be like. And on that basis, you could have a real transformation.
Bob, thanks very much.
Thanks, James. If you have questions or an idea for something you'd like to hear us discuss, then write in. The email is socialismpodcast@socialistparty.org.uk. And you can help us get the word out. Leave us a 5-star review, subscribe so you don't miss out, and share the podcast to help us get more listeners. Socialism is produced by the Socialist Party. This week we heard from Bob Labi, speaking to James Ivans, and I'm Scott Jones. Read more and find out about joining the fight back at socialistparty.org.uk. And until next time, solidarity.